Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 9 cheat sheet. And if you guys have not watched the video series before, the cheat sheet is basically a continually updating tier list where I sort of look at all the positions in FPL at all sorts of price points and rate players based on future fixtures and as well as the underlying stats and what I've been able to glean so far from what managers have said and what we've seen on the pitch. Now, as far as this week, we haven't had too many updates because of the international break. And I do think, once again, it's worth calling out the myth that is international break injuries. Yes, of course, a lot of players play 2 games, but it's just one more game in addition to, let's say, anyone who has a midweek fixture. So, for example, an EFL Cup game or Champions League game, not too much impacts are actually felt from an FPL point of view. And we can also see that through very, very minimal price rises and falls. I'm still waiting for that Saka price fall. If you guys are new, I would also really appreciate if you guys could like and subscribe. Also, I think only 20% of my viewers are actually subscribed to the channel, so I really appreciate the support. Now, heading on towards the video, midfielders to start. I do think Palmer deserves a rise. Ultimately, you're looking at a player here who I think is really valuable simply because he is a much better version of Archer when you look at, let's say, creating a 3-4-3 template. So I don't think Palmer is, for example, your 7th midfielder or your 7th attacker. Rather, he's sort of your 8th attacker in a 3-4-3. I see him as a pure bench option for the next few weeks because Chelsea's fixtures are very tough, with the exception to the Game Week 10 home game versus Brentford. And then after that, because this wild card, or if you plan to wild card, let's say, will last you towards Game Week 20 at the bare minimum until your second wild card, that's why Palmer is actually very valuable, because Game Week 16 plus is very, very good for Palmer. But as I said, he's more of a wild card pick. He's not someone I would be wasting a transfer for anytime soon. Now, as far as Gordon, I think he's a fantastic option. Him and Neto, for me, are still the kings in this sort of position. Gibbs-White has a singular great fixture, but I'm not sure about his value, particularly since with Awani out, I think Chris Wood having a lot of minutes within this team will probably also mean that chances that Gibbs-White get penalties will probably be reduced. And therefore, I'm really more so looking at, let's say, someone like Hwang, who could be a differential if you don't want to go with Gordon or Neto for the time being. So Hwang is someone who I think has more risk when it comes to minutes. And I think you're better off really relying in Neto. But Gordon as well is someone who I think I like a lot more, just because his open play stats are actually very, very good. Underlying stats for expected goals and expected assists are very high. And also you get to rely on a much stronger attacking team like Newcastle. As far as the 6.X position, you've got Diaby, who still for me is the king here. But I don't think his position as the king is going to last too long. Ultimately, it's a case where Game Week 9 and 10 are great fixtures, and then actually by the time Game Week 10 rolls around, you've got players like Bowen, Mitoma around those price points who probably have better fixtures, arguably, right? And also better minutes. As far as someone like Mbumo, he's someone who just has a great game for Burnley, and then after that has tougher fixtures, but we know that he actually has some value because no one else really in this position actually has the benefit of being a penalty taker. So that also has a lot of value when you look at, let's say, for example, the Nottingham Forest fixture where he didn't really do too much. And of course, we have seen, for example, a slightly different role where he's playing sort of right wing back at times. He still ultimately can get penalties, and he should have really got a penalty in that game based on even, for example, the referee's review. As far as, let's say, Mitoma, as I said, I think he's a Game Week 10 option. Ward-Prowse and Richarlison, I've actually both dropped. I just think when it comes down to it, would I rather actually have Ward-Prowse in my team or Bowen? I think definitely I would prioritize Bowen. I think it's hard to say that Ward-Prowse is a sort of talisman for this West Ham team, and they're not particularly strong. So when you, let's say, compare it to Neto and Hwang, he's actually more expensive than the two of them. And even though he has some intangibles like set pieces, I just think Ward-Prowse is probably someone that I would avoid tentatively. And Richarlison, unfortunately, with the early substitution, which was obviously impacted by the Basuma red card, I owned Richarlison, but I see him really as a short-term punt. I think this is really the last fixture where you can rely upon Richarlison to effectively have good minutes within this Tottenham team, because a lot of players are coming back from injury, and we also know that because of his generally poor form, it's very hard to sort of foresee him being actually a continuous starter for this Tottenham team, although things may change, in the short term. But the fact that he's taken off at 45 minutes, and of course there was an option between him and Kulusevski, and it was so easy, I guess, for Ange to actually take him off, just suggests that probably Richarlison isn't the pick that we really want. Ultimately, at his cheap price, I think if he becomes a starter ever again, he's a great pick. But for now, obviously, someone that you could probably look to move out on in Game Week 10. And that's why we have so many options in Game Week 10 that are very, very nice. As far as the 7.X position, Maddison for me is still the king. I do think Szoboszlai and Bowen are great picks. For me, Bowen is just one fixture too early. I've said that, for example, with the Newcastle game previously, that was just a very, very tough game to sort of jump onto Bowen, for example, on a wildcard 8. I do see the possibilities of going to Bowen, as I said, very much so like Mitoma on game week 10. It could be a case where, of course, Bowen could haul once again versus Aston Villa, but it's still an away fixture, which I think is very, very tough as well. I don't really like going into players like that. As far as Szoboszlai, he's a player where I don't think the ceiling is necessarily high, but if you, let's say, need someone who actually has a good fixture in game week 9, I think he sort of fits in a nice little hole in your team if you need someone in that position filled. And on top of that, of course, the fixtures are just perfect for Liverpool, and his minutes are very secure. So compared to some of the other options within this list here, his minutes are going to be so variable, and that's why I've put an asterisk as well on Luis Diaz, because I think coming back from international duty where he's playing with Colombia for now, he's probably going to have reduced minutes. We've always seen that Liverpool have always been very generous, I suppose, with the minutes and sort of spreading them out with the players who are coming back from international break, particularly from South America, and they're one of the few teams that actually have at least 2 to 3 players from there. So that has an impact on Luis Diaz and his minutes. And because Gakpo also, we saw him out of a boot and ready actually almost 2 weeks ago, the fact that he's got in that 2 weeks rest is going to be huge and essential for him and his minutes going forwards, with, of course, someone like Jota coming off of his suspension. Another great pick within the 7-point position is going to be Martinelli. We do know there's some sort of slight injury with Trossard, and of course Arsenal have been dealing with injuries so far, but I do think his minutes should be very, very consistent. They shouldn't be obviously at the level of Saka and Odegaard, who, if they're fit, should be playing much more than him, but Martinelli at 7.7 with so many price falls recently due to his injury actually means he's a fantastic pick, because as soon as Game Week 10 rolls around, I think these Arsenal picks are fantastic. You might not be able to afford, for example, a team that includes Saka and Odegaard. Instead, I think Saka, Martinelli, and some other more well-rounded picks, like let's say the ability to go Trippier off of that, can be actually an upgrade to your team, so to speak. So I think Martinelli is actually a very valid pick. You might even want to prioritize him over, let's say, Bowen, if you have more confidence, for example, in this Arsenal team going forwards than, let's say, West Ham. As far as Foden and Sterling, it's more so a case of fixtures. I think Foden, of course, has a great singular fixture, and his minutes actually so far have been really, really good. Very comparable, for example, to Alvarez, who's also played a lot of good minutes so far. But I think with Foden, the one thing I would probably say is that Alvarez is, once again, first of all, cheaper. So when you make that direct comparison, it's like, how much budget can you actually fit within your team? And I do think Foden's a touch expensive considering his fixtures. And then on top of that as well, this season, Foden's underlying stats have been very, very poor. So when you actually see all the sort of superstar cast of these midfielders, outside of Szoboszlai, really, Foden's actually someone who really, really falls short. And this is sort of on a per 90 basis as well. The expected goal involvement is actually very, very low, much lower than last season. And he has still overperformed a little bit so far, which is actually natural to Foden, in my opinion, because last season he did the exact same thing. But early signs suggest, of course, that he's not been, a fantastic pick, and I think the fixtures make it tougher for him to be that pick going forwards. As far as, let's say, Sterling and Foden in the future, obviously we can revisit them around Game Week 16 plus. As far as, let's say, the 8-point exposition to Son, I still think Fernandes is a good pick. I can't deny it. Had a great international break, but of course, yes, he's coming back to this United team, so we need to sort of ground ourselves back in reality. But the reality as well is that, with the exception to, let's say, Game Week 10, which is a very, very tough game, he's got Sheffield United, he's got Fulham, and he's got Luton Town at home. So hard to say that Fernandes is actually a bad pick. I think Rashford's diminished minutes make him a bit worse of a pick, which is why obviously we dropped Rashford last week. But I think nothing really changes within this position, just because with Saka, there's a little bit of an asterisk just to see what's going on with his injury. And with Odegaard as well, he's more of a Game Week 10 transfer for me. So I think if, let's say, you're someone who's persisted with Fernandes so far, I would persist with him through the Sheffield United game. And if you're really sick of him, then you can actually transfer him out in Game Week 10. He's a perfect placeholder for someone like Saka or Odegaard if you want to sort of claim them back if you've already lost Saka. For example, I'm on a wild card and probably looking to sort of replace Richarlison in the future on Game Week 10. But for now, of course, Fernandes serves a role. And if you actually think United will pick up because of the fixtures, then simple reality is Fernandes is probably actually a good option to hold. As far as Son, I sort of see him has a great hold as well. But we are sort of closing into a time where the Arsenal fixtures, in my opinion, are slightly better as soon as Game Week 10 starts. So it's a question of whether you're actually willing to move your Tottenham asset on Game Week 10 into an Arsenal player and sort of jump ahead of the curve, in my opinion. Because right now, if I was wildcarding, I think I'd be, sort of forward-looking when I'm getting an Arsenal asset, even though they've got a Chelsea game, but also you're sort of passing up on the Spurs game, which is why wildcard 9 is so odd, and I think why a lot of us prefer wildcard 8/10, even though technically Liverpool's sort of defensive and offensive fixture runs perfectly line up with Game Week 9. And that's it, and that's why Salah, for example, remains the king. As far as the forward position, we have Foster, who basically is, your equivalent of a Palmer. Now, he's a little bit more expensive, but I think obviously you can argue he has better fixtures in the short term. But as I said, this wild card, or if you plan to wild card anytime soon, has to last you quite long, right? So you could wildcard a 19 and you probably don't care about all these picks, but if you're wildcarding anytime soon, Foster could be an interesting consideration for a 3-5-2 if you have any faith in this Burnley attack. And he actually has decent underlying stats so far, nothing crazy, but We also know that ultimately we're seeing Foster being crucial to the attack, and he is very, very cheap. No one else at this price is something that I would really consider. I think, for example, stretching towards Edouard or João Pedro is too much of a reach for now, and I probably wouldn't go towards them, particularly given that Crystal Palace have looked like a very, very flat-footed attack without Eze, and then with João Pedro, the minutes are still very, very poor continuously. Plus, a lot of people are actually back from injury. As far as Calvert-Lewin, he's sort of new to the cheat sheet as well, but ultimately it's a case of Everton's good fixtures have sort of passed them by. They've performed well in them from an underlying stats point of view, but actually they've been very, very poor when it comes to clinical finishing. Players like Doucouré and Calvert-Lewin have actually stepped up in recent times, and of course I think Calvert-Lewin will continue to be a starter with Beto now sort of sitting on the bench, but his minutes also will be contested as well, and his physical fitness obviously still isn't up to scratch. As far as, let's say, the 6.x position, nothing changes here other than the fact that Jackson sort of reintroduced into this sheet here. Jackson is someone who, look, when Chelsea have good fixtures again, we can definitely reconsider. And I think if you're an FPL manager who's willing to, let's say, look past mistakes, I suppose, and also players performing poorly for you in the past, Jackson's definitely one to revisit really when Game Week 16 rolls around. As far as the 7.x position, nothing really changes, unfortunately, because we haven't had any significant updates on, let's say, Isaac's injury as well. So there is an asterisk over him. And then as far as players like Darwin, Jesus, Wilson, we still don't exactly really know. Wilson obviously was struggling with fitness before the international break, but should be fully fit. However, if Isaac's fit as well, I do think it's a case of, let's say, Isaac being in good form once again. Maybe he actually gets some starts, and also Wilson hasn't had any match fitness so far. Darwin and Jesus, both players who've obviously played within the international break as well, but Jesus is probably more likely to actually, start minutes and actually have good minutes because Arteta is someone who I think is less likely to rotate, even though he talks about how much he loves to rotate and how much he doesn't have a starting 11. But we all know what the truth is. As far as, let's say, Alvarez, I think it's fantastic if we actually get confirmation that he starts, but there is a high likelihood as well that he could get benched. I still think, though, that Alvarez is at such a ridiculous price for what he brings to the table, and actually he brings so much more to the table than we thought, by Game Week 1, because actually since Game Week 1 and since the KDB injury, what we've actually gotten from Alvarez is the knowledge that he's on additional set pieces, and we've seen, for example, great direct free kicks so far, but also the opportunity for him to actually cross from deep as well and actually get assists there. We just haven't really seen any sort of set piece goal so far from this United team, from the City team, sorry. And then when it comes to Watkins and Haaland, I still think they're the priority options. Now, a lot of people have actually considered dropping Haaland, and that for me is completely justified, but I also think you also have to realize that probably the best way to actually play the captaincies for the time being is actually, for example, a Haaland captaincy versus Brighton and Bournemouth, and then Salah captaincies in and around. So I personally have, for example, created my wildcard to fit both Salah and Haaland, but I can understand managers as well sidestepping the Haaland captaincy, because, for example, in Game Week 9, it's a perfect Salah captaincy as well. You might even argue that it's a good Son captaincy. Game Week 11 is a little bit more contentious for me, but if you're willing to sort of pass up the value, I suppose, of having Haaland as a captain in Game Week 11, then you can argue Haaland's not essential. No one's really essential in FPL, but it's just about what you prefer, what your sort of risk appetite is, and what you truly believe is the best captaincy for Game Week 11. As far as the defenders this week, not too many changes as well, because I think we made so many wholesale changes in the past. I do think I have to admit sort of a little bit of an apology here with Guehi. He's someone that I actually haven't, and I've actually forgotten to add him onto the cheat sheet previously, just simply because I've actually rated Johnstone as the Crystal Palace goalkeeper, and I've always been thinking, the coverage of Crystal Palace defense comes from someone like Johnstone, but I completely acknowledge that that's not the case. Of course, your 4th or 5th defender can very much be Guehi as well, and he actually has great fixtures once again from a defensive point of view after that Newcastle game, so he's a fantastic pick, and so is Anderson. But Anderson actually going, a lot higher up in price, I think is a little bit unjustified in terms of, I think it is a part of a sort of casual reaction to the fact that Anderson has scored 2 goals. Guehi, there isn't really too much different when it comes to the underlying stats that really suggest, even historically, that Anderson is a better goal threat than Guehi. I think it's just how it's happened. For example, you have a huge aerial threat like Dunk, who didn't score last season, but was still able to actually score recently, and that this just happens from time to time with center backs. You can't really guarantee when the holes are going to come. It's not like someone is as consistent a goal threat as, let's say, Gabriel, for example. Another new option that I've actually added to the 4.x defender position is Tsimikas as well. I think there's a huge asterisk, of course, conditional with, let's say, Robertson's injury, and we'll probably get additional news from Klopp as soon as we get the first press conference. But we also probably want to stay tuned to Game Week 9 as well and see whether he actually starts in that fixture, because that will probably tell us whether Tsimikas is sort of nailed for the time being. And as I said, Tsimikas is probably going to be a yellow pick so far, but he could easily rise to being a fantastic option as soon as game week 9. So we just need a little bit more information, but I think we can say early now that Tsimikas can be one of the sort of game-breaking picks, you know, at this sort of game week 9 to 10 juncture. And with Soufal, I think he's a new addition, but really it's just sort of another sort of matchup to another player like Agurd here, who also has good fixtures coming up for this West Ham team. I think the fixtures from a defensive point of view for West Ham are going to be very, very good. But what I will say is, compared to a lot of the teams on this list, I think West Ham is very definitively one of the worst defenses to feature here in the sort of 4.5 defender position. It's more so a case of the fixtures are lining up with them. Whereas, for example, with Botman, even though the fixtures aren't perfect compared to, let's say, games like Burnley at home or Sheffield United away, the reality, of course, is that Newcastle are spades and spades better as a defense than West Ham. So, of course, the fact that Botman and Burn previously were at 4.5 prices was sort of a bit of an outrage, if I'm being honest. Now, as far as the 5.x position, I've actually added White because I do feel like now that, of course, Saliba is quite high in price and White, obviously, he's actually had a great price, but also I think he sort of has the bonus element of being nailed at all times, doesn't really have the proclivity to be an early sub, or even, for example, tactically, I think be rotated out of the team. I think White is such a good option. But of course, he's very hard to reach and he might not be justifiable, you know, when you have options like Gabriel and Zinchenko, who seemingly are, you know, first team players. We'll see, of course, what happens with Gabriel and Zinchenko going forwards, but there is, of course, a risk, I think, and a little bit of an asterisk to them, whereas with Saliba and White, you don't have that, and that's why you sort of are paying for that sort of premium, I suppose, of not being able to be rotated. Now, as far as the 6.x position, Trippier, of course, remains as the king. I have added Virgil here just because I think with Konate and Matip, even though the fixtures are very good, you can't justify who's going to start over the other. So for me, this is a time and place for Virgil to be a very, very good pick, just because the Liverpool fixtures are fantastic, and he still is one of the better aerial threats in town. As far as Alexander-Arnold, with the early sort of Gomez substitutions, yes, of course, you can sort of react to that and say Gomez didn't play particularly well versus Brighton. Mitoma was still able to do, you know, his work. I still think, though, that maybe Trent isn't as essential to this Liverpool team in its current state, right? Someone like Szoboszlai, for example, is so much more crucial to the team. You could argue that also he's had an impact on Trent, and you can see the underlying stats as well have sort of dropped off a little bit this season, which I think is something to look at because, of course, there's a context of 10 versus 11. There's the context of just not enough games of sample size, and also, once again, Liverpool having slightly tougher fixtures. So over this easier run of games, I'd expect Trent, of course, to be a better pick, but we'll see what happens. In terms of the goalkeepers, I have to say there are some sort of wholesale changes here, most likely because Arula and Turner seem to be such a strong pair that it's really hard to ignore actually the value that you're getting from them. Not to mention that some of the best keepers in the game are also at that sort of 4.5 to 4.8 price with Johnston and Raya. So I have preemptively downgraded, for example, Pope and Allison, even though I don't think they're necessarily bad options. It's just more so the case that you can actually probably save your money in the outfield positions and actually benefit from actually going with a cheaper goalkeeper pair. I just think this is the reality. And with Leno and Onana, it's more so a case that Leno fixtures are getting worse and worse. And so, unfortunately, with, let's say, for example, the Sheffield United fixture gone, the fixture turn just means that he's going to drop as an option. And with Onana, probably for the first times ever, I'm going to react to goalkeeper form. And the shot stopping has been atrocious. I do finally have to react to it. We have enough of a sample size so far to probably just early say that Onana is struggling with a little bit of confidence so far. And United, of course, they have been sort of rotating so much and chopping and changing due to injuries as well in the defensive positions, where I don't have the sort of confidence in that. But yeah, that's why Onana falls as well. Ultimately, I think it's a case where you can just invest into the cheaper defenders and the cheaper goalkeepers, with the exception to, let's say, Trippier, who's still fantastic. But that's sort of the landscape of FPL. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments, and feel free, as I said, to like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.